Welcome back. Introduction to Corrections. Professor Bowen here. We had a little bit of technical difficulty last week, so I was unable to make a video for week 4. So we're going to combine the 2 weeks, weeks 4 and 5. So you guys are in week 6 right now. You took your midterm. I went ahead and went through and hand graded the midterm. So everything, if there was a question on that, it should be settled now. The same with quiz 2. So if there's still a question, please make sure you're letting me know, hey, I think I should get credit for this, and we can talk it out. So jumping right in, for week 4, the juvenile justice system. So the question that we were talking about was the juvenile justice system as far as its differences from the adult system, and what are the concerns as far as institutionalization. Now I want to start out with the second half of that, so I don't think we really flushed that out quite enough in our discussion post. And the fear for the juvenile justice system is this idea right here of the stigma. So you start getting in trouble, you start getting into being remanded to a facility. That institutionalization that we've talked about before and how detrimental that can be, well, we're starting that much earlier in the juvenile justice system. So if you end up in a juvenile justice facility, the fear or the impact of institutionalization is that it starts to appear that's an acceptable way of life much earlier. So you have a lot of these key developmental stages when you're much younger, prior to adulthood, and we don't want institutionalization to be part of that developmental stage. So as much as we can, we try to use side door programs or rehabilitation versus incarceration. And so that's the focus, really, is one of the biggest differences in the juvenile justice system, is the focus is more on rehabilitation than it is on incarceration or punishment. Also, a huge distinction that I didn't see a lot of people put in is the age of legal responsibility. So in many states, there's a certain age where under that you can't be held responsible, criminally responsible, in most cases for anything that you've done, because they don't feel that you can develop the mens rea. Mens rea is the guilty mind, right? It's Latin for the guilty mind. So anytime you have any kind of criminal responsibility, and if you guys have had other criminal justice courses, you've gone over this before, you have to have 3 things, basically. There's a lot of times more to it when you look in the individual crime, but the 3 basic components of criminal liability is the mens rea, which is the guilty mind, the actus reus, which is the guilty act, and then a concurrence of the 2, so you have to have them both together. So I like to use a Venn diagram for that. You have the mens rea, or the guilty mind. You have the actus reus, which is the guilty act, and then right here when there's a concurrence of the 2, that's where criminal liability lives. So if you take one of those away, then you don't have criminal responsibility. You may still have a crime, but you don't have criminal responsibility. So the idea of not being able to develop mens rea or mental age, mental capacity, is by removing the mens rea from the crime. We'll talk a little bit more about this, brain development. So I want to really quickly talk about the brain. I think I put this in some of the responses. If you look at the brain, this is a side view, a horribly drawn side view of the brain, but just a quick, since some of you will get this in psychology or biology or whatnot. So the brain, this is a side view of the brain. Here you have the brain stem. This down here is the temporal lobe. Then you have the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, and the occipital lobe. Here's your cerebellum, deals with balance. Cerebellum is Latin for the little brain, because it looks like a little brain stuck on the big one. Your brain develops this way. So it develops from the brain stem, the limbic system, these areas that are autonomic, and it develops forward. The frontal lobe is the least evolved part of our brain. It's the last to develop. And the frontal lobe, of course, is where we have logic and reasoning. So the frontal lobe is the last to develop, somewhere around age 25. Now this is not to say it's like you flip a switch, like 25, the light comes on and you go, oh my gosh, I haven't been using logic and reasoning. Now it's different for everybody, but that's about when it's fully developed. If we were to cut this in half and look at the top of the limbic system, right about here there's a little almond-shaped piece called the amygdala. The amygdala deals with fear and aggression. It's an emotional response part of our brain. It allows you to interpret emotion from people's facial expressions, people and animals. When a dog growls at you, you don't have to be taught that the dog's mad and it's time to back off. Your amygdala tells you that. The problem is what we see on brain scans is the younger the child, when they make a decision, This is the area that lights up, the amygdala, so it's an emotionally based decision, versus older adults whose decision-making process is in the frontal lobe. Now, I want to be very clear, this is not to make excuse for deviant behavior in juveniles. It is not to excuse deviant behavior in juveniles. But it is very important that we understand deviant behavior in juveniles. And then in a lot of times, it can be part of the family system. It can be a lack of social norms, as far as the social norms being socially acceptable, coping skills, mentorships, things like that. So the juvenile justice system looks at those and tries to take into account development of the brain, psychological development, and then moving forward. We also talked about, a lot of you guys put the idea of family systems into your juvenile justice system, saying, well, there should be a program to have the juveniles deal with their families and have their families involved. And in a lot of cases, that's a great idea. However, the family is a system. And if the family system itself is broken, then you certainly don't want to send the child back to a broken family system without any socially acceptable coping skills to help them to deal with that. So that was kind of week 4. You guys did a great job with that. There was a lot of good ideas. And then moving on to week 5 now, we were talking about the Supermax prisons. And a lot of you really nailed the idea that they're extremely costly. When we do a cost-benefit analysis, it's kind of hard to justify their existence because they are so costly. But also some of you said, how do you put a price on safety? Safety of the inmates, safety of society, and safety of the correctional officers that are working there day in and day out. And I completely agree with that. So when we look at rehabilitation, we realize that Supermax has very little rehabilitation. But as some of you adequately pointed out, when you look at the inmate population that is there to a Supermax, they didn't get there for singing too loud in church, right? They're there for a reason. They're there because they couldn't play nice with others. They're there because even though they're incarcerated already for deviant or criminal or violent behavior, even within that incarceration, they became such a problem to maintain that they had to be moved to this Supermax facility. So yes, it is exceedingly costly to house them there. There is zero rehabilitation or very little rehabilitation. But we have to look at the fact that they didn't really demonstrate any interest in rehabilitation in the first place. This is not to say that we have throwaway people. We never want to look at any human being like that they're just throwaway people. Immanuel Kant, who's a theorist, talked about in his idea of ethics that a human being can never be a means to an end. The human being is the end in and of themselves. It's a categorical imperative. So we have to ensure that if there is any rehabilitation that they're interested in, that we make sure those programs are available. It's very difficult to do, and the Supermax prison, as a lot of you pointed out, really kind of came to be out of desperation. There's a certain population of inmates that we simply don't know what to do with. I think that there was a little bit... a few of you were really over-exaggerating the terrorist aspect of it. Supermax prisons aren't completely filled with terrorists. We really don't even have that many terrorists that we could house with those. But we do have gang leaders and then the ultra-violent, those that are violent towards other inmates and are violent towards the correctional officers at every given opportunity. So yes, there are certain terrorists or people associated with that. But the gang leaders are every bit as dangerous, if not more. I mean, there's more violence in this country from gang activity, more deaths, more murder, more costly than terrorist acts. Terrorist acts, although frightening, are not as frequent as gang activity. So basically, the idea of the Supermax is that they are necessary, even though they're exceedingly costly. Yes, we can get the same. We can get the same out of a SHU, special housing unit, or an administrative segregation, but those, in a lot of ways, aren't enough. We need the Supermax facilities for certain groups, for certain people. One of the things that we have to bear in mind, and this is actually coming up again and again and again, and when we go through corrections, it will be a constant theme, is that we, in the correctional system, we have an obligation, we are required, we have a duty to care for those in our charge. So when we look at terrorists and gang leaders and serial killers or child murderers and rapists, we really kind of have this instinct to just be done with them. You know, you go to prison, whatever happens to you, happens to you. But we have to remember that the incarceration itself is the punishment. We can't allow horrific things to happen to them just because we don't like what they did. We have an obligation to maintain their safety and to uphold their Eighth Amendment right against cruel and unusual punishment. So, like it or not, we have to ensure the safety of all inmates because, let's face it, they're human beings that made bad decisions. So, be that as it may, the major downside, aside from cost, to Supermax prison is the lack of rehabilitation, but as some of you pointed out, there wasn't a whole lot of interest in this population to rehabilitate in the first place. So that's weeks 4 and 5. We're moving on to week 6. You guys are into the Zimbardo prison project right now, one of my favorites. You're doing a good job with that. I encourage you to really think through that and see how that applies to a real-world setting. It's one of the most important things for a correctional officer to realize that there exists certainly a undue balance of, not an undue, but a balanced shift of power, a differential of power between those who are in charge in the prison facilities, correctional officers and whatnot, and those that they are there to care for. Without safeguards, it's very easy to engage in abusive behavior, and with the diffusion of responsibility, it's easy to say, well, he did it, they were all involved. So this is bigger than just the Stanford Prison Project. I want you to look at it as the Abu Ghraib, what happened there at the military prison in Abu Ghraib, and what happened in Attica, what happened in other prisons where there have been riots, where people were abused and suppressed until they fought back. So how do we maintain that balance of keeping the peniological objectives, making sure that we are incarcerating and keeping safe, but also not abusing? You guys have some pretty hard-hitting assignments coming up in the next week. You need to have your final papers are going to be due very soon. Your final projects are due at the same time. Make sure you're checking the syllabi and see those due dates. I'll put that in this video as well. There is a Dropbox for you to submit those, so make sure you're submitting those into the Dropbox. And other than that, if you guys have questions, comments, or concerns, you can always call or email me. I'm pretty good about responding. And other than that, I will check in on you guys next week.